Ahmed, thank you very much for that really lovely introduction. I'm truly honored and privileged to participate in the Medventions conference this year, and look forward to making it somewhat interactive. And we'll really start the session with just a relatively brief presentation on what I hope will be helpful to your attendees in terms of how to approach investors in medical device digital health at an early stage, either at the seed or very early stage of companies. And I have spent quite a few years, several decades, on both sides of this issue. Early on as an entrepreneur myself, as you mentioned, having founded 2 medical device companies, both in the cardiovascular area, but both that required multiple rounds of financing, and that fortunately it ended up having successful exits, as you mentioned, one through an IPO on NASDAQ quite a few years ago, and the other through a more traditional acquisition by a public medical device company, Spectranetics. That entity, as it turned out, was subsequently acquired by Philips, the Dutch large global medical device company, a number of years ago as well. Over the last few years, I would say 4 years or so, I have really actually focused more and more now, almost all of my time and energy on early stage investing in medical device and digital health companies, both at the beginning as an angel investor through my involvement with 2 organized angel groups, both in the Bay Area, quite well known. Life Science Angels, arguably the best known organized angel group that is focused on medical device, digital health, and other life science type very early stage companies, as well as the Band of Angels, which I believe may be the oldest organized angel group in the US. They're both in the Bay Area, as I mentioned. More recently, in the last year or so, I've been involved in maturing early stage companies more within the realm of venture capital, and founded recently with a partner, Baymed Venture Partners, and that entity is really focused on investing in companies that are in venture capital parlance, more Series B, if you will, or late Series A type of companies. My talk today is going to focus on early stage investing in general, because I think there's a lot of relationships even between seed investing and some of the earlier venture or institutional investing rounds. A little bit about the team of Baymed. There are 2 founding partners, myself, and I gave you a little bit of introduction about myself, both as a clinician for many years, interventional cardiologist, as well as a serial MedTech entrepreneur, and more recently, an investor. My partner comes from the investment world and has spent 20 years focused on healthcare investing at some of the top tier investment firms, both public companies, private equity firms, and has had significant experience serving on the boards of a number of these companies, as well as having had a stint in industry working as a finance executive at a successful medical device startup company that ultimately got acquired for several $1 billion that some of you may be familiar with. It was in the left ventricular assist device, LVAD market, and was acquired by St. Jude. We are supplemented by key advisors in this sector, both on the clinical side, arguably one of the preeminent clinical trialists in the world, Professor Greg Stone, who was for many years at Columbia University, now more recently at Mount Sinai, and is one of the main directors of the most important interventional cardiology meeting in the world, the TCT meeting that some of you may be familiar with. Leslie Saxon serves as our digital health key advisor, and for the last decade has been the executive director of the Center for Body Computing at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, but also is legitimately a renowned key opinion leader in the clinical area and was an electrophysiologist, practicing electrophysiologist for many years, and was actually chief of cardiology prior to her current position at University of Southern California, and before that, an electrophysiologist at UCSF in the Bay Area. And then finally, Martin Rothman, who is quite a renowned figure in the medical device industry, was a clinician for many years, but for the last part of his career, the last decade or so of his career, served as chief medical officer for Medtronic, which is the largest medical device company in the world. We believe, because of the clinical expertise that we have, that we approach startups in a different way, not just because of our understanding of the unmet clinical need, but because we are truly agnostic to the regulatory pathway. And while many investors in venture and for medical device companies are generally less inclined to invest in companies that have the more complicated PMA pathway in the US, we in fact embrace disruptive, innovative, differentiated technologies, which often require a more complicated pathway. But as you can see here from this table, and this is data from John Norris at Silicon Valley Bank, in fact, companies that develop the more differentiated products often are associated with a better return on investment, multiple on investments, as you can see here. And paradoxically, the time to exit may be quicker because often acquirers will pull the trigger on the acquisition prior to commercialization with these companies, because their feeling is that the main areas that need to be de-risked are clinical and regulatory areas, and would rather take on the commercialization than leave it in the hands of the startup. Whereas in the case of companies that have a less complicated pathway, the so-called 510K pathway in the US, often acquirers would like to have validation from the markets and commercialization. So in general, when we look at companies, we're clearly more interested in how big the unmet need is, how important it is, the capabilities of the team, their experience, and less worried about the regulatory pathway, recognizing that different skills may be required depending on what pathway is required for the company to become commercial. While I invest in very early stage angel or seed investing as part of my involvement with angel groups, Baymed, our venture fund, is particularly focused on maturing companies. So in venture capital parlance, that would be Series A and B. We believe there's a unique opportunity and a funding gap there, and less competition from other investors. On the other hand, if one looks at seed investing, there's been a ubiquitous amount of funding that has developed over the last decade, and more than a tenfold increase in funding compared to the beginning of the prior decade. And a lot of this comes from multiple different sources. They can come from incubators and accelerators, from a variety of professional angel groups, as I've already discussed, particularly in the US, but also increasing in other countries, and from non-dilutive sources, government funding. In the US, of course, we have SBIR. Ireland has Invest Ireland, Israel has IIA, and many countries have developed sources of funding, as well as family offices and foundations that have a particular interest in the technologies that a startup might be working on. In contrast, the late stages also have been crowded recently, with crossover of funding sources from the non-traditional investors, such as private equity firms, crossover hedge funds, and corporate VCs. And so even in that case, in the latest stages, there often is ubiquitous sources of funding. We are particularly interested in sourcing companies in North America. We're based in the Bay Area in San Francisco. And in fact, being in San Francisco does present some unique advantages, 30 to 40% of early medical device companies are actually based in California. And of course, there are some other important hubs in the US, including Minneapolis, Boston, and a variety of other places. And Canada is becoming more important recently, and we're particularly interested in sourcing unique and exciting, innovative companies in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. So we view North America more from our perspective as a unified geographic area. Our sources of funding come from many different places. Over the last few decades, both my partner and I have developed relationships from many different potential sources, angel groups, syndicating with other venture capital groups, incubators and accelerators, of which there are many in the US, deep relationships with physician entrepreneurs, both in the US and Canada, as well as our involvement with many different industry conferences and organizations. As I mentioned earlier, we're also focused on Israel, which we think is a very exciting ecosystem, particularly for medical devices and digital health in the last decade. And again, because of affiliations with sources of these companies, and because we believe that these companies have demonstrated in the last decade an impressive increase in successful exits through M&A and IPOs. And also, we really like how capital efficient many of these companies are, being able to achieve important milestones with less invested capital than some of their competitors in other ecosystems. And so we view companies in the Israeli ecosystem as an important source of potential investments outside the US. Now, that's not to say that there isn't tremendous innovation also occurring in other areas in Europe and in Asia, but as you could tell from the earlier slides, we are a focused fund with a small number of key individuals. And from a bandwidth standpoint, we generally are not looking or planning to invest in companies outside the geographic areas that I already mentioned. This is a fun slide that kind of summarizes some of our relationships in the US, Canada, Israel, with different incubators, accelerators, and academic centers, and really feel that those are important relationships to help us cultivate sources of excellent new companies. So we are, as I mentioned, particularly interested in medical devices and digital health, and we're agnostic to the clinical space. Even though I come from the cardiovascular area, where everybody's interested in aesthetics and dermatology, robotics, orthopedics, as we are in cardiovascular. But it turns out that if you have to pick one area to have clinical expertise, cardiovascular is a good one, because in general, if you look at cardiovascular, broadly stated interventional cardiology, now structural heart disease in the last few years with transcatheter valve repair and replacement, heart failure, electrophysiology, peripheral vascular disease, neurointerventional, stroke management. So broadly stated, cardiovascular makes up 50% or more of all medical device startups. When it comes to digital health, we are interested more in the convergence of digital health and medical devices. Digital health is a somewhat nebulous term and encompasses many different areas, potentially including healthcare, IT, wellness healthcare, and a variety of other things. But our particular focus is that convergence of digital health, the application of machine learning, artificial intelligence to devices, particularly as accelerated by COVID, the use of remote patient monitoring, virtual care, chronic disease management, and smart sensors and wearables. So this is the area that we tend to focus on, but understanding that digital health does encompass other important areas as well. So how do we approach companies that we're interested? Well, we are investors, and while I think many people that work in life science and are involved with startups and healthcare understand that there is an element of impact investing and some altruism, but I think it's important for entrepreneurs and for those of you that are either thinking of having a startup or already in a startup, that you have to be able to appeal to investors based on your ability to return on their investment. And that in many respects, there's no difference between investors that invest in life science and those that invest in fintech or insurtech or any of these other areas. There has to be a clear and well understood exit strategy, meaning a liquidity event for your investors, and that has to be incorporated for us in the investment process. We have to see a clear path and an understanding that you're going to get to an exit. In the case of medical device companies, in most cases, there are some exceptions. And last year was an example where we saw, in the last couple of years, we saw more than the usual number of IPOs for medical device startups. But in general, the path to an exit or liquidity event is through an acquisition, which means that somebody, some corporate entity, generally speaking, has to feel that your company, your technologies fit into their pipeline. And so that it is essential early on that you understand who those acquirers are, why you might have a compelling technology that will be of interest and value to them, and how you can, if it were, move the needle. You're going to have to be able to convince them yourself first that whatever your technology is, once it becomes commercial, it will be able to generate the kind of revenue that will be meaningful to the company. And if you're going to have a company that's only going to generate at best 10 million in revenue years into commercialization, you've already excluded most of the more important corporate strategics that make these kind of acquisitions. IPOs can be important depending on the technologies. It may be more relevant to some digital health companies that can be brought to a certain scale. And again, that's going to be dependent on the type of revenues that can be generated, the growth of those revenues, something called CAGR. These are things that you're going to have to understand, whether you're scientists or clinicians, and become more knowledgeable about business, even if you bring on more sophisticated business people into your startup. So this is not atypical for any venture type of investor, but this gives you a sense of what we look at. And when you send a deck or when you reach out to a venture investor, don't expect that they're suddenly going to get excited because you're excited about your company, because we see a lot of excited companies. And there are venture investors that see more than we do. We see about 1,000 pitches a year, more than that. That's 20 a week. And for our ability to be able to do a deep dive, it means that we have to be able to quickly screen, thumbs up, thumbs down, and then make a decision whether or not we want to do a deeper dive on a company. So 1,000, 20 a week. Of those, we try to whittle those down to 50 that we are then going to take a deeper dive or do intensive screening. And that means taking a harder look at how important the unmet clinical need is that the company's trying to address. It needs to have a total addressable market. Nowadays, generally, we won't look unless we think it approaches $1 billion. It used to be in the past that if we thought the TAM was a couple $100 million, that would be interesting. But if you can't really convincingly show that there is a potential TAM of $500 million to $1 billion, most venture investors will not pay attention. In general, we want the team to have people that are experienced in entrepreneurialism and have done life science, medical device, digital health in the past. Ideally have had exits in the past, but we know that everybody has to start somewhere, and that for many scientists and clinicians, they won't have had that experience. Well, if you don't have it, you need to bring it into your team, either through bringing on or hiring employees or key advisors, or an advisory board that has individuals that have had that type of experience. One of the most important predictors of whether a startup will have a successful exit is whether members of the key management team, the senior management team, have done it before. It's the single most important predictor. So it's not that we won't invest in a company that hasn't done it before, but it's something that has to be compensated in some of the ways I've mentioned. And in addition, we're going to pay more attention to be sure that you really are solving an important unmet clinical need and that the markets are very large. Once we do the intensive screen, we try to whittle it down to about 20 companies where we do a deep due diligence. And at the end of that, we may invest in 3 to 5 companies per year, and that's out of 1,000 initial companies. This is very typical for most venture firms. You need to understand that. And so the likelihood of getting a commitment of investment from a sophisticated venture investor is less than 1%. And it doesn't mean what you're doing isn't good. You're just going to have to keep at it and have to meet with as many potential investors and find those in which your message resonates, and also include the other non-traditional venture investors. So in the case of very early stage, it's going to be the groups I mentioned: organized angel groups, incubators, non-dilutive government sources of funding, university sources of funding. All of those need to be exhausted. And of course, at the earliest stage, friends and family. It's certainly not uncommon for founders to be using credit cards, saving accounts at the beginning if you really believe in what you're doing. And frankly, when you do that and have skin in the game, it makes it easier to convince other investors to join you on your journey. So what's the target company that we look at? And I would say this applies to any experienced investors, including angels, independent angels, individual angels, high net worth individuals, family offices, organized angel groups, as well as venture investors. You need to be solving an important unmet clinical need. It all comes from there. The worst example, and one that I generally won't even consider, is if I'm approached by a founder because they feel they have some really interesting technology and they want to talk to me about where this might be able to be used in medicine, because I'm a clinician and I'm also an investor. If they come to me with that approach, I can tell you almost uniformly, I'm done. No further discussion is necessary. It all starts from doing needs testing and identifying an important unmet clinical need, and ensuring that unmet need is widely applicable. And so that means it potentially will be a large market. As I mentioned earlier, we're very interested in disruptive and differentiated technologies in medical devices and digital health, even if it means that the regulatory pathway is more complicated in the US and Europe, Asia, wherever that is, because we believe that provides some important advantages. Sometimes patents can provide good protection for your technology. Sometimes it's not sufficient. Importantly, a very complicated regulatory pathway like a PMA pathway in the US might actually provide better technology protection than a thicket of patents, and having both even better. And as I mentioned earlier as well and showed you data, it can also mean that the pathway to an exit can be expedited and that the return on our investment might be better. But having said that, it doesn't mean that going for a more complicated regulatory pathway is an easy route. It means that the pitfalls need to be understood. The team has to be experienced. They know how to negotiate. They have to know how to negotiate and navigate with the regulatory agencies, the most important, of course, being the FDA, and perhaps have members of their team, not perhaps, but have members of their team that are highly experienced in navigating regulatory pathways. A high quality management team with a proven ability to execute. And we certainly recognize that first time founders may not have that intrinsically, but they need to be quick studies. They need to be adaptable. They need to be open to learning and mentoring, both from us, as well as bringing on the kind of key advisors that will help them. And clearly, the technology in the company nowadays needs to add substantial value to the healthcare system and to patients. As I mentioned before, there has to be a defined pathway to a strategic exit or an IPO, and that has to be built in early on. And finally, this applies more to Canadian companies and offshore companies, Israeli companies, and this is something that I think you should be aware of if you're not. The corporate structure is important. For US-based investors, angel investors, venture capitalists, we are very mindful of what your corporate structure is. And what I mean by that is that, in particular, we have very significant tax advantages if your company is set up as a Delaware C corporation, a US company incorporated in Delaware as a C corporation. And the reason for that is in our tax code is something called QSBS, or qualified small business stock, that we as investors, angel investors, individual investors, venture investors, have really a very significant tax advantage if we invest in a technology company, medical technology company, digital health company that is set up as a Delaware C Corp, such that within certain qualifications, we pay no capital gains or any kind of taxes, if you will, that are relevant taxes if you have a successful exit, up to $10 million in capital gains. It's an extremely valuable tax benefit or exclusion. And if you're a Canadian company and you're incorporated in Canada, we don't get that. If you're an Israeli company, we don't get that. If you really want to get the interest of US investors, you have to consider at some point how to bring this kind of incorporation into the equation. It can be done in a variety of different ways. It could be on the scope of this session today, but it can be something as simple as setting up a shell company in the US as a Delaware C Corp that wholly owns the Canadian subsidiary or the Israeli subsidiary, but all the functions, particularly for an early stage startup, are still in the where you're domiciled if it's Canada. And so the R&D work, all of that work can be done there, but generally speaking, the assets need to be owned by that Delaware C Corp for the US-based investors to get that tax benefit. The other reasons we like Delaware C Corps is because it's a more familiar corporate structure and governance. And for investors that are investing in companies outside of our geographic area, outside of our country, that familiarity can be helpful in assisting you in getting funding. So the next couple slides, I'm really going to go through what I think might be relevant for you in terms of seeking out funding, particularly if you're a very early stage, potentially even pre-venture capital startup. We talked about reincorporation as a Delaware C Corp for the reasons that I gave. You may or may not wish to do that. If you don't, it doesn't mean that you will not get US investors. It means that you will likely exclude a very significant percentage of both venture capitalists and sophisticated angel or organized angel groups. Critically important that you remain capital efficient. One of the reasons we tend to invest outside of the US, particularly in the Israeli ecosystem, is because we believe those companies can achieve more with less capital. I think some Canadian companies are able to do that, but I think if you can really demonstrate the fact that you will be good stewards of our capital, that is an attractive feature, and some of you may be able to do more easily in Canada than in the US. Silicon Valley and the Bay Area is an extraordinarily expensive place to do business, yet we do have many startups here, obviously, but in very high quality, great innovation, but it is a very expensive place to do business. There is no question, and I tell all startups that I deal with, to the extent possible, you should apply and exhaust all available government and other sources of non-dilutive funding. Of course, in the US, we have SBIR. In Israel, there's the IIA that has played an important role. Ireland has done a great job seeding very early stage companies. And I know there's funding like that in Canada. It also can be funding from academic institutions. It's not just a matter of considering it prestigious. There is some prestige to it, but I will tell you that private investors, while we like companies to have these sources of funding, we also recognize that what attracts those sources are different than what attracts institutional investors. So we don't view it entirely as a badge of honor. On the other hand, we really like that some of the development that a company has to do can actually be offset by funding that's non-dilutive. And from your perspective, it allows you to go further along in terms of the life cycle of your company and to get to a more mature phase, which would then make you more suitable or more attractive to institutional or private investors. So very important, exhaust all of these sources to the extent possible. Other important sources that should never be overlooked are family offices. There are literally thousands of family offices, and these are basically high net worth families that have set up offices that, if they're large enough, will also earmark some of the money to make private investments, not just investments in public companies and in real estate and a variety of other things, but will invest in make alternate allocations, alternate investments. So this may be private equity, venture capital, or even direct investments or co-investments in early stage companies, particularly if your company fits with the mission of that family. And so that family may care, for example, about lung disease. Perhaps they had a family member that had cystic fibrosis. That would be an example, or other types of medical issues. So you should really do the research and try to identify these family offices. And this may be an excellent source of early funding for your company. Similarly, applying to charitable foundations, we all know some of the very big ones, or nonprofit foundations, whether it's the American Heart Association or any of the other ones that have mandates that allow them to invest in related startups. Not all of them do, but you should do the research and make a list of those as well. Very importantly, in the last decade, is many of the corporate entities, large corporate companies, or even private companies, have started to invest in early stage companies. And many of them will do it even at a very early stage, but you need to understand what their mandates are. You need to get to know the individuals, if you can, within these companies that are head of venture investing or business development or corporate strategy. Those are generally the functional areas that are involved early on with companies. Get to know them, reach out to them, meet them at conferences, and try to understand at what stage they may be interested in making direct investments into early stage companies, both to get to know you better and potentially as a placeholder for later investments and ultimately acquisitions. Because as we discussed earlier, in most cases, medical device companies are going to exit through acquisition. In recent years, organized angel groups of the kind that I already described, in particular the ones that I'm a member of, Life Science Angel, Band of Angels, have taken the place of early stage venture capitalists and do seed investing or even early Series A investing, and often will syndicate with other angel groups to make investments of several $1 million. Typically, angel groups will invest several $100,000 to $1 million or $2 million. That's sort of the range. If you're looking for a $20 million round of investing, which most of you wouldn't be at this point, but if you were, that's generally beyond the capabilities and generally beyond the interests of organized angel groups. So typically, angel groups are looking to invest several $100,000 to $1 to $2 million, maybe more, or to be part of a syndication, could be more than that amount. And typically companies that are early enough that their so-called pre-money valuation is in the single-digit millions, they generally won't be interested in making a first investment. If you think that you're worth 20 or $30 million, you probably shouldn't be even thinking of those numbers based on what I understand most of this audience is. But generally speaking, if your pre-money valuations, if you understand that terminology, or what you think your company is worth is generally in the low digit millions, and you're looking to raise hundreds of thousands to $1 to $2 million, organized angel groups could be an excellent source of your first or early investments. There are a limited number of MedTech focused venture capital funds that invest at the early stages. Most of the VCs in the United States and around the world now, most in the last decade or longer after the great financial crisis in 2008, most of them moved to later stage and invest in C, D rounds, pre-exit rounds, and have lost interest in investing in early stage companies that they deem to be too high risk. Now, I would say that as a relatively blank statement about 3 or 4 years ago, but interestingly enough, over the last couple of years, perhaps some of it accelerated by COVID, some of these larger groups like Sequoia, NEA, that have multiple billions of dollars under management, have started to look at investing at earlier stage companies, part of it because of the competition that now exists in the later stages, because they're now competing with private equity funds and hedge funds and so on, but also because they've realized that if they don't fund the earliest stage companies, there won't be late stage companies later on. They'll just dry up. So there are more and more MedTech companies, MedTech VCs that are investing in earlier stages, but it's still relatively small compared to those investing in the later stages. It's reasonable to consider foreign investors. For Canada, that might be investors from Asia and elsewhere, but it's very important if you, and you should ultimately consider your company one that will be operating to a large extent in the US, which remains still by far the most important market in the world for medical device companies. You need to be aware of geopolitical issues. And in the US now, companies that are funded by foreign entities undergo screening by a committee called CFIUS, the Committee for Foreign Investment in the US, if they're technology companies, and that also includes medical technology. So you need to be very careful as you go forward in terms of where your sources of funding are. If they're outside of Canada, even though Canada is foreign to the US, obviously Canada is considered a very close friend, the UK is, other countries are, but you need to be very mindful of how a major investor from outside of the countries that I mentioned might be viewed by CFIUS, and particularly if you end up forming a Delaware C Corp. As a final comment, I would say there's been a lot of frothiness in the markets, in the private markets in the last few years during COVID. We actually expected the opposite early on, but things changed and valuations have been driven up. There's been a lot of competition from many new investors that have entered venture investing and angel investing, and the valuations have gotten frothy. But I would caution you, we all believe that a correction in the private markets is likely here, and it often follows the public markets that are undergoing a correction now. And be very mindful that even though you may have seen some high, lofty valuations, that you need to be circumspect. And one of the big mistakes that are made, that if you get too high a valuation early on, you're almost certainly going to need to have additional funding in the future. You may price yourself out of funding or have what's called a down round in the future, which can be very damaging to the company and to the reputation of the company, and very problematic in terms of your ability to raise additional funds and move forward. So be reasonable about it, and also understand that the amount you raise needs to be appropriate for your stage. It might seem seductive to try to raise very large amounts of money, but not only will that cause dilution that could be painful for you later on, it also may make it challenging for you to raise funding at all. It's also important not to raise too little money. It should be right-sized. It should be based on the milestones that you believe you can achieve with this round of financing, perhaps with a little bit of margin to it. So it needs to be very thoughtful. It's not something you just think up, or a number you pick out of thin air. It needs to be based on what you think you need, the growth that you hope to achieve, the milestones that you think are important that are going to increase in a very relevant way the valuation of the company, and associated with the valuation that you think your company currently has. So I'm going to stop there, and I would be happy to entertain any questions for the remainder of the hour, Ahmed. And again, it's been an honor and a privilege to participate in this conference this year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gershwani. That was a very insightful presentation. And again, we appreciate you taking the time to share those extremely valuable insights from your extensive experience on the process of early stage medical technology funding. Yeah, let's open it up for questions if any of the audience have questions. Um, I do actually have a couple of questions. Maybe I'll start. Uh, you talked about the criteria and key elements that VCs look at when evaluating opportunities in the medical technology field. I'm just wondering, how would a pitch to a venture capitalist be different from a pitch to an angel investor, or is it pretty much similar? Uh,
I think the pitch, so if you're including organized angel groups, like life science angels and the band of angels, generally we will approach an investment in the same way that a venture capital group will do. And in fact, when I make investments as an angel, I do the same due diligence as I do as a venture capitalist. The difference tends to be more the stage of the company. So angels generally make their first investment at the angel stage, which is generally the seed stage.
Right.
And most of them now won't even do pre-seed. They won't do the earliest investment. The expectation is that a company will have gotten some funding from friends and family, perhaps from non-dilutive sources, grants, and so on, and have the ability to demonstrate some proof of concept, perhaps some excellent bench models, early animal studies, working prototypes, minimally viable products. Those sorts of things are our expectations, even as angels. Now, in individuals, if you have a friend who is or someone that you have a relationship with that is a high net worth individual or has a family office, they may be willing to invest with less diligence, if you will, mainly because of the relationship you have. But I would say that whether you're approaching an organized angel, whether you're a group, whether you're approaching a sophisticated family office or venture capitalist, in general, your pitch will need to be very similar. It's just where you are in the life cycle of the company. It's more likely that if it's organized angel or family office, that you'll be at a seed or early Series A stage in venture capital parlance. If you're meeting with a VC, you will likely have, at least one or two, small earlier rounds of financing and probably a little further along in your development as a company.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gershoni. Yeah, another question I have, and I think you touched upon this a little bit in your presentation. So, the VC sector was hard hit by the 2008 financial crisis. And at the time, the venture firms began shifting their investment away from startups to later stage, kind of less risky companies. I'm curious, given, the pandemic, and again, you talked about this and how the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the importance of innovation in digital health technologies and being able to adapt and supply medical device products that support our healthcare workers. I'm curious to know, how do you see the current landscape for VC investment in the US and Canada, specifically, after the pandemic, which we're still suffering from its impact, and now the war, the Ukrainian crisis. I'm just curious about your speculations with respect to the implications on the VC investment landscape.
So the great financial crisis is sort of almost a vague memory now, thankfully, but it's about 14 years ago. And what happened is about a third or more of venture capital firms basically imploded. And what happened is the remaining firms bulked up and acquired more capital under management and tended to move more to later stages. The companies that or the firms, the investment firms that were mainly early stage were the ones that were hardest hit, as it turns out. However, COVID perhaps paradoxically had the opposite effect, and in fact, an enormous amount of investment in venture capital, private equity, but primarily venture capital has occurred over the last 2 years. In fact, records have been set in terms of investors, limited partners, LPs, if you will, whether they're endowments, pension plans, other investors that have allocated money, huge amounts of money, unprecedented amounts of money to venture capital, and similarly, unprecedented amounts of venture capital has been invested in startups and in companies. So For many reasons, some understood and some not, the last 2 years or so has really brought unprecedented amounts of money into venture capital and into startups and investing into startups. And as a result, also led to competition over investing, increases in valuations, some of the things I alluded to before.
Yeah.
What do we think is going to happen in the post-COVID era? Well, predictions are always, subject to being proven wrong. And of course, we actually thought that the opposite would occur with COVID at the beginning, and it's been really unbelievable historically in terms of the amount of investing in the sector.
Right.
But there are predictions that this is going to cool off for a variety of reasons. Some of it because we're seeing, somewhat of a correction in the public markets, and the private markets tend to follow the public markets for a variety of reasons. And also because valuations have gotten frothy and perhaps too high, which means it'll be difficult for investors to achieve the same kind of returns on investment, because the returns on venture investing in the last few years have been, again, unprecedented, high double digit, 40, 50, 60% year on IRRs as measures of returns on investment. And so it's unlikely that that can be replicated at that level. And so again, this may have an impact on the investors that actually put money to work in venture investing. So I think most of us feel that there is still going to be a strong investment environment over the next couple of years for venture capital and other private investing, and that there particularly will be an interest in healthcare, life science, disrupting it, because there is a strong understanding and belief that it needs to be disrupted. So digital health, of course, and broadly stated, we think is going to be a very opportune area, but again, a little bit difficult to separate the winners from the losers, and very crowded. Many areas are very crowded, and how you differentiate and how you protect IP is a little bit more challenging in digital health. But I would say in general, the belief is that we are still going to have a significant amount of capital that is deployed in this asset class and deployed to early stage companies, and that life science in general is going to benefit by that. And so I think it still will remain a very good time to be an entrepreneur and a founder of a life science company.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gershoni. Dekra, you have a question? Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I wanted to ask you from your experience. So you showed this chart of having seen like on an annual rate, a VC sees 1,000 over 1,000 pitches and ends up with 3 to 5 after the due diligence. So in your experience, has it been that out of these 3 to 5, some of the companies that had failed miserably, and what had you learned from that experience? Was it because of something that went wrong during the due diligence, or was it because the market is just unpredictable? I'm just curious about your experience.
There's so many reasons why startups can fail, and the earlier you invest in a company, the more reasons there can be, because there are technical engineering reasons, there are regulatory reasons, there are clinical reasons, not to mention the ones that occur later, which is executing, the commercial go-to-market strategy. There can be running out of money reasons. So the earlier you invest, the riskier it is. And the classic venture model is that you invest in 10 companies, 5 will fail because of a multitude of potential reasons. 2 to 3 will give you very modest returns, and 1 or 2 will give you the 10x, 10-time return on your investment. That's been the traditional model. I have to say, I think the model is not the best model in life science, and I think that we have to be better at that. And I think understanding the risks better, all of the different risks, clinical, regulatory, and what have you, but also being able as an investor to be value added. Many venture capital investors, at least in the past, traditionally in life science, might have gone to a prestigious business school. They might even have a science degree, but they never had experience as operators or entrepreneurs. And when a company encounters bumps in the road or challenges, which is invariable, it doesn't matter how good the company is or how good the management team is, there are going to be serious, important bumps in the road. And so the ability of the team to pivot, to navigate, to overcome those challenges is probably the single most important factor in determining whether that company will be ultimately successful. And I would add, having venture investors or investors that can be part of that solution is important. And often in the past, investors have really, other than bringing capital, have brought very little other value add to the companies that they invest in. So I think that's very important. And that's important to you potentially as an entrepreneur founder, to not just be excited about getting money to get more of it or to get it at a good valuation, but sometimes it may be worth compromising some of that to get the kind of investor that will be there to help you, either by additional capital when it's necessary, or simply by being able to mentor you because they have been successful in their own right as entrepreneurs. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you is that arguably the single most important thing to evaluate, and it's not that unmet need and markets aren't important in the technology, but I would tell you that for most successful venture investors or angel investors, we have come to understand that the team is probably the single most important entity in terms of our decision making, their experience, their track record, their ability to adapt, their ability to be mentored. Not that we want people that aren't confident, have egos, but that despite that, really have the ability to learn from mistakes and to work well with others, to be part of a team, and to accept constructive help. And the data supports it. The Kauffman Foundation, which is a very well-known foundation in the US that does research on venture investing, has shown that the single most important predictor of the successful outcome for a startup, it's a 3x improvement in outcome compared to other variables in terms of predicting which company will be a success, which rather as opposed to which will fail. So I think there are a lot of reasons why companies fail, but despite our best efforts, but these are some of the factors that we look at to try to mitigate those risks.
Thank you. And the comment about the team, presumably how long they've been a team is important, because you can assemble a team of like really great people, but then just assemble them before the pitch and then convince the investors that you have a great team. So does it matter if they've been working together for a long time?
Well, you won't convince sophisticated investors.
Okay.
I mean, you can't game it like that. That's not going to work. And every company has, a multitude of so-called great, advisors. If you don't, that's a red flag because everybody else does.
Okay.
Everybody does. It's you and the key people that we care about. And what I mean by you, it's the CEO. And the CEO is the most important individual. You may have, a Nobel laureate as one of your advisors. That won't compensate if we don't believe that the CEO has the goods.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gershoni. Hamida, you have a question? Please go ahead.
Yes. Thank you. First, thank you for your wonderful talk. I wanted to know when you said about seed investing and early stage companies. So to what extent, for example, for a health tech company, should be established that you consider that one for your review if they apply for investing?
So if I understood your question, it's what stage do you need to be at as a company in order
exactly
to be suitable for seed investing? And I think I did allude to that earlier. And I said most organized angel groups won't be your first investor. It needs to be friends and family, government grants, all that sort of thing. Generally, we would like to have a fairly good proof of concept, whether that's from an established bench model, early animal studies. That would be very important. A minimally viable product, that your team is starting to take shape, that it's not just, somebody who's a research PhD in somebody's lab, and then they've got a few advisors that are helping them out for free. There's no company. We don't invest in science experiments. I mean, I can go on, but I think I'm giving you sort of a general idea.
Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Any more questions? Okay, so this really concludes our session. Thank you again, Dr. Gershoni, for taking the time to share this knowledge and valuable insights with our trainees and students on one of the most important topics in healthcare innovation. As a clinician and a seasoned entrepreneur who has experienced the funding process from the perspective of the innovator and investor at different times, you've provided really a lot of invaluable insights and lessons learned on the process of raising capital and reaching out or pitching to investors. Thank you again for this. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Please note that we don't have any lectures scheduled for the coming 2 weeks. Our next lecture is scheduled to take place on Tuesday, April 5th, and we're going to have a lecture on marketing, sales, and distribution strategy in medical technology. So thank you again and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gershoni. Have a good night.